The cradle arrived in a shipment of 6. 2 French prams, a Norwegian bassinet, a German floor rocker, an unidentifiable iron-framed crib, and the one I'd marked Polish based on the runners. The listing just called it unmarked 19th century wooden cradle, Lower Galician region, no padding, no lining, nothing extra. That's how I prefer them, untouched. It was built narrow and long, meant for swaddling. The oak was blackened with age, joints worn smooth from decades of quiet creaking. A single vertical crack had split one of the side panels, but the runners were intact. No modern repairs, pegged construction. I paid just under $400 for it, not including the container fee. When the truck dropped the pallets at my door, I handled the cradle first. I've always had a preference for Eastern European pieces. There's a kind of silence carved into them that I don't find in Western builds. Less showy, more intimate. They're built for rituals most collectors don't even want to ask about. I slid it off the crate and brought it inside, past the archway, past the windows, and into the back corner of the studio where I kept similar pieces. The cradle fit the space like it had always been there. Dust layered off it in gray sheets when I brushed the surface, trailing between the slats like powder off bone. I took a dry toothbrush and swept the joints. The spindles were delicate, hand-lathed with slight asymmetry in the turning, tighter on one side. The runners curved in wide, shallow arcs. I pushed lightly on the top rail to check the stability. It rocked, just once, forward, then back. The sound it made was soft and hollow, like the dying breath of something wooden. I caught the rail with my palm and steadied it. Habit. I always test movement. It helps me identify if a piece has been over-restored or reassembled. I didn't think about the motion. Not then. The day passed like most. I logged the other pieces, cataloged the condition notes, cleaned rust from a set of antique drawer pulls. The sun dipped behind the frosted windows around 6. By 8, I was upstairs making tea. I'd been living above the shop since the lease expired on my apartment last fall. The building used to be a bakery. Wooden floors, brick walls, bad insulation. I liked it. I didn't notice anything wrong until after midnight. I was at the desk going over auction listings, flipping between email chains and a scanned invoice when something changed in the air. Not the temperature, though, was colder, but the texture, like the stillness had gained weight, heaviness in the chest, static in the back of the throat. I paused and listened. Nothing, but I could feel something low, dull and rhythmic, like a heartbeat that didn't belong to me. I stood and walked barefoot to the stairwell. Halfway down I heard it. Soft, wooden, creak, not a groan, not the building shifting, something deliberate. I stepped down another tread and held the railing. Creak, same tempo, same space between, forward and back. It was the cradle. I didn't turn the light on right away. My eyes had already adjusted, and the moon was slanting in sideways through the front windows, casting long pale lines across the floor. The cradle stood where I left it, still, but the moment I stepped into the room the sound stopped. I walked to it slowly. There was no movement, no disturbance in the dust around the runners, no shifted shadows. I pressed my fingers against the rail, cooler than the air, slightly damp. I lifted the cradle off its runners just an inch and felt the weight. Still balanced, no give. I stood back and stared at it. Maybe it was the floorboards. Maybe a truck passed and rattled something. I'd felt worse with less cause. A pipe once burst under the foundation and mimicked footsteps for a week before I found the source. But this didn't feel like any of that. It felt intentional. I stayed downstairs a little longer, trying not to look at it. I kept working, scanning, resizing, logging entries. I told myself it had been nothing. But then the sound came again, fainter this time, almost gentle, creak. I looked up, still nothing moved. I waited. 40 seconds later, another creak, same pitch, same breath between. I stood and walked over to the cradle. I pressed it with my hand. It moved an inch, then returned. I set it back into place, ran a cloth beneath one runner, and wedged it stable. Then I turned and went upstairs. I didn't fall asleep until after 3 a.m. The next morning, the cloth had been pushed out from beneath the cradle. It sat 2 feet away. I stood over it, still barefoot, unsure of what exactly I was looking at. The cloth I had wedged beneath the runner the night before, a folded scrap of linen from an old military sack, was now crumpled near the corner of the room, not dragged, not ripped, as if someone had picked it up carefully, carried it, and dropped it. I turned to the cradle. The runners were perfectly aligned again. The cradle had returned to a neutral rest position on its own. I bent down and checked the floor. The cloth had been flattened where it had rested under the runner, but there were no drag marks, no clear evidence it had been forced out. It looked like it had just been removed. I set it aside and retrieved a wedge block from my workbench, hard pine, cut to resist shifting. I eased it tightly beneath one runner and stacked a 10-pound brass weight against the other side of the cradle. It wouldn't budge now, not from vibration, not from air. By the time I returned upstairs, the air in the shop still felt off, not threatening, not cold exactly, just thinner, as if the building was breathing shallow through the walls. I didn't mention the cradle to anyone. It didn't feel like something that should be shared casually. I had a call that morning with the seller from Bratislava about a carved birthing chair, and then I fielded 2 email quotes for refinishing work. I tried to stay busy. I didn't go back downstairs until evening. When I did, the cradle hadn't moved. The wedge block remained firmly pressed beneath the runner, and the brass weight was still in place. Nothing else in the room had shifted. I checked every corner. The studio was quiet. I turned on my phone and opened the camera. I set it on a tripod across the room and pointed it at the cradle. Centered, wide angle, full visibility of the floor. Then I opened the camera app and started a time lapse. Nothing fancy, just a slow, low-light capture. I left it running and went upstairs. Around midnight, I came back down and checked the feed. Nothing. I watched it twice, 4 hours compressed into 12 seconds. Nothing moved, no sway, no shadow. The cradle didn't so much as twitch. The wedge held. Still, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, blinking at the dark ceiling and listening to the house. At 3 a.m., I heard the first creak. It didn't sound like the night before, not a long groan, just a faint tick like something settling into weight. Then again, a little louder creak. I pulled the blanket back and sat up slowly. The sound was coming from below. I moved to the stairwell and held my breath. Creak, then silence. Then, beneath that, fainter still, a breath. I didn't know what I was hearing at first. Not exactly. It was high-pitched, shallow, almost like wind blowing through a bottle. But it had rhythm. Inhale, hold, exhale, slow, damp. I crouched and listened harder. The breathing didn't change. It wasn't getting closer. It wasn't going away. It just stayed, right below me. I waited until daylight before I went back down. The air was different again, stale, heavy in the corners. The phone was still recording, still untouched. I stopped it and played back the last few hours. For the most part, nothing changed, until the 2:58 a.m. mark. The video showed a faint tremble in the shadows across the far wall. Not a movement of the cradle itself, just the quality of the light, like something passed between the lens and the object. The screen briefly pulsed darker, then returned to normal. At 3:01 a.m., the wedge block shuddered, not knocked loose, just shifted. A fraction of an inch. I rewatched it 5 times, same result. The brass weight didn't move, the cradle didn't lift, but the wedge shuddered. I leaned over and examined it in daylight. The edge had a hairline split. I hadn't noticed it before. I pulled the wedge out and replaced it with a larger one, oak, angled tighter. I also wedged a clamp beneath the opposite runner and looped a strap around the frame to a nearby workbench. I reset the phone. This time I recorded in full video, not time-lapse. That night, I didn't go upstairs. I sat in the corner of the shop with a small lamp, eyes fixed on the cradle, and waited. Nothing happened for hours, but around 2:45, the lamp flickered. Just once, then again. Then it dimmed to half brightness. I turned on my phone and watched the battery drain 3% in a minute. The air around the cradle changed. I didn't see movement, not directly, but I felt it. There was a pressure in the room, then creak, soft, like weight shifting. I held my breath and kept watching. The cradle remained still. The strap was taut. The wedge didn't slip, but the clamp on the runner twisted slightly, as though something inside had pressed down unevenly. And then the breath came again. Not loud, not like someone standing close. It came from low to the ground, high-pitched, wet, like a baby with fluid in its lungs. I didn't move, didn't look away. It lasted for 30 seconds, then it stopped. I didn't sleep. At dawn, I checked the video. It was all there. The flicker, the clamp twist, the soft creak. I played it again with the volume up. At 3:02 a.m. I heard it, quiet but unmistakable, the sound of inhalation. Not a wind, not a draft. Something alive. I saved the footage, uploaded it to 2 different drives. I didn't know what I was going to do with it, but I knew I needed it. The next night, I didn't record. I just listened. I turned off every light in the studio except for the wall sconce above the far window. I didn't want shadows. I didn't want flickering. I sat cross-legged near the storage racks, across from the cradle with a fleece blanket wrapped around my shoulders and a thermos of lukewarm tea beside me. The air hadn't shifted yet. It was quiet, neutral. I counted my breaths to keep myself from counting time. I didn't look at the clock. I watched the cradle. The strap was still looped around its mid-rail, anchored to the bench. The wedge was firm under the runner. I had left it completely bare. No cloth, no pillow, just wood. I wanted to be sure nothing would move unless something made it. At some point after 2, the air began to cool, not gradually. It dropped in 1 minute, a single breath colder, like a window had been opened that I hadn't heard. I stared at the cradle. It didn't move, not even the shadows around it. Then I noticed something strange. The sound in the room had changed. It wasn't that something was added, it was that something had been taken. There was less of it. Less hum from the fridge upstairs, less background hiss from the walls. It was like sound had been pulled into a well. I stood up slowly, moved toward the cradle with careful steps, and crouched low. Still nothing moved. But the surface of the mattress board looked different. I leaned closer. There was a faint mark at the center of the board, a small, almost circular patch of discoloration, darker than the rest of the wood, like someone had pressed their palm there for too long. I raised my hand to match it. The shape was smaller than my hand, much smaller. It wasn't an adult's handprint. It wasn't even fully formed, just pressure. A round depression about the size of an orange. I didn't touch it. I stood and backed away. At 3 a.m., the light above the window flickered once and then steadied again. The cradle didn't move, but I heard something, a click, soft, then another. It took me a second to understand. It was the sound of nails tapping lightly on wood. Fingernails. A finger, small, deliberate, dragging along the inside rail. I held still and stared at the cradle's upper edge. Then slowly, a hand appeared. Fingers first, pale, small, slightly curled. They curled over the top spindle with no sound, no hurry. The hand settled, stopped. It didn't shake, it didn't grip. It just rested there, as if the limb behind it had finally reached high enough to pull itself forward. The fingers looked wrong, not because they were grotesque, because they were perfect. Too pale, too smooth, like wax before it's been carved, like the skin didn't know how to wrinkle. The nails were faint, almost translucent. There were 5 of them, each barely wider than a toothpick. The middle 2 were curled slightly inward. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I counted 27 seconds before it slid back down, vanishing below the cradle rail. The room remained silent. I approached the cradle slowly. There was no movement beneath, but I could see, under the rail now, the edge of something dark and fabric-like, thin and wrinkled, bunched low against the base. I didn't lift it. I didn't want to see what was underneath. I turned away and returned to the corner of the studio. I stayed there until sunrise. When the light came through the windows, it felt like color returned to the world. The pressure in the air lifted. The stillness relented. I stepped toward the cradle again. The rail was clean, no hand, no fabric visible, but the faint pressure mark on the mattress board had changed. Now there were two, one at the center, another just above it, like something had rested there and shifted position. I looked around the studio for any sign of movement. Everything else was untouched. The wedge block was still tightly braced. The strap hadn't loosened, but then I noticed the folded rag I'd left near the sink. It had been moved, only slightly, as if someone had stepped too close and brushed it with their heel. I retrieved my phone and played the recording. The hand wasn't visible in the footage, but the audio picked up 3 faint creaks around 2:58 a.m., followed by a dragging sound at 3:01, then a soft tap, then silence. No breath this time, just movement. I rewatched the video again and paused on the frame at 3:02. There was a slight darkening beneath the cradle, like a shadow pooling below something solid. No legs, no shape, just a darker presence. I saved the footage. I didn't edit it. I didn't touch anything else that day. But that evening, when I went to sweep beneath the cradle, I noticed something else. The 2 pressure marks on the mattress board had grown. They were deeper now, more defined, and between them, just barely etched into the soft grain of the wood, was a third shallower mark. An outline, not pressed, not dirtied, scratched, a faint arc, the curve of a skull. It hadn't been there the day before. I took a cotton swab and ran it gently along the grain. The scratch didn't smear. It wasn't soot or residue. It was carved, lightly, but deliberately. The arc stretched from just below the head of the larger pressure mark and curved downward, as if something had rested its head there for hours, then pressed upward, tracing its own absence. I stepped back from the cradle and sat at the edge of the workbench, staring at the marks. I knew better than to call this a coincidence. Whatever was happening wasn't a trick of light or wear. The evidence was building, slow and specific, and always overnight. I took a photo, uploaded it to my catalog, and marked the item as withdrawn from sale. Then I opened my laptop and typed a message. I remembered a professor I'd met at a restoration lecture in Vienna 4 years earlier, Dr. Marek Lenko, a quiet man who specialized in Eastern European folk artifacts. He'd given a talk on regional death masks and village customs for unbaptized infants with a kind of weary reverence I hadn't forgotten. I found his old email address in a folder labeled Academic Contacts and sent a message asking for a video consult. I told him I had a cradle from late 19th century Galicia, unmarked, but with possible ritual use indicators. I kept the language professional. I didn't mention scratches. I didn't mention breathing. Just asked if he was available for insight. He responded within the hour. The call was scheduled for 2 p.m. I cleared the cradle out of the camera frame and set up the shot with a neutral background. When his face appeared on screen, I could see he hadn't changed much. Gray beard trimmed close, glasses perched low on his nose. He spoke slowly, as always. I described the piece, its dimensions, and the markings. I sent over high-resolution photos of the cradle, focusing on the mattress board and spindles. I told him about the crack in the side panel and the unusual condition of the wood, how it had been completely stripped of finish, no oil, no stain, no wax. He listened carefully. When I finished, he leaned forward and adjusted his glasses. "I think what you have," he said, "is not just a cradle." I waited. He continued, "In parts of Galicia, especially among the Ruthenian and Ukrainian villages, it was common for stillborn children to be laid in cradles for mourning. Not in the arms of family, not in coffins, cradles. They believed the soul lingered for a time, that it hadn't been fully turned away yet. The cradle became a resting place between worlds." I asked what happened after. "In most cases, the cradle remained untouched for 7 days," he said. "No rocking, no movement. It was placed in a quiet part of the house, sometimes with a small token, a blanket, a thread, a name not spoken aloud. If the child had not been baptized, the cradle was never to be reused, never disturbed. And if it was? I asked. He paused. It invited death back in, he said. He leaned closer, voice lower. The idea wasn't that the spirit returned, but that the absence became a space, a hollow that something else could occupy. It wasn't a child. It wasn't anyone. What was it? He shook his head. Just what was left. I asked him about markings, specifically if there were any practices involving pressure patterns or etched shapes. He nodded. Sometimes, families would mark the wood discreetly. 7 lines beneath the board, a small cut near the head rail. These weren't decorative. They were meant to fix the soul in place, to give it boundaries. The moment those boundaries were broken, rocking the cradle, for instance, those protections unraveled. I thanked him and ended the call. I didn't move for a long time. When I finally did, I took the cradle apart, not fully, just enough to check the underside of the mattress board. There they were, 7 faint notches, scratched beneath the center slat in a vertical line, not decorative, not aligned. Each mark angled slightly, as if scratched by someone in grief, alone in the dark. I set the board down and sat cross-legged on the floor beside it. I thought about what he'd said. The cradle wasn't a vessel for memory. It was a vessel for something waiting. I opened my browser and searched deeper. I found a digitized ledger from a now-defunct ethnographic museum in Lviv. It cataloged regional mourning objects recovered from rural houses abandoned between 1915 and 1943. 2 entries mentioned silent cradles. One included a note, "Never rock empty, death may answer." Another translated proverb, "Do not lull the air, it learns your breath." The phrasing stayed with me. I cross-referenced several of the symbols I'd seen in the grooves around the spindles. Some were just wear marks, but one near the headboard was deliberate. A triangle carved shallow, base down, pointing inward toward the cradle. It wasn't a symbol I recognized. I emailed Dr. Lenko again and attached the close-up. He replied an hour later. That mark was used in Death Watch customs. It points the soul inward. If reversed, it was believed to allow passage. Do not reverse it. I hadn't touched it. But I looked again, just to be sure. It still pointed inward. That night, I didn't touch the cradle. I didn't even stay in the studio. I went upstairs, bolted the stairwell door, and tried to sleep. At 2:37 a.m., I woke to a sound I hadn't heard before. It was like fabric being shifted, dragged lightly across wood. A small weight-shifting position. Not a groan, not a creak. Just the subtle noise of something settling. Then came the breathing again, shallow, slightly higher in pitch than before. No crying, no words, just presence. I didn't move from the bed. I kept the blanket pulled to my collarbone and stared at the ceiling, listening. The breathing didn't grow louder, but it didn't fade either. It stayed constant, measured, wet, faintly congested. I turned slowly toward the stairwell door. The light outside it was off, but a sliver of reflection shimmered beneath the crack, like something was blocking the hallway window. The sound didn't change. There was no whisper, no cry, just breath. Eventually, it stopped. I didn't sleep again. By morning, the house felt normal. No pressure in the air, no residual chill. But I hesitated before going downstairs. I had to force myself. The studio door creaked open easily. The light inside was clean. Nothing was overturned, nothing broken. But something had shifted. The cradle sat farther from the wall than I remembered, about 6 inches closer to the center of the floor. The strap I had secured was limp, draped across the runner. The anchor point had slipped loose from the bench clamp. Though the screw remained fully tightened, I knelt beside it. The strap hadn't been ripped or pulled, just unhooked, as if done carefully by a hand that knew how not to make noise. The wedge block had been nudged, not knocked out but no longer flush. a centimeter or two back, just enough to allow a slow movement. I turned toward the mattress board. There was something beneath, the blanket. I had not placed a blanket there. It hadn't been there the day before. A thin layer of linen now lay across the mattress board, soft and off-white, folded precisely to the corners. There were small, faded red stitches in the corner, stars and crescent moons, barely legible, dulled by time. I reached out and pinched a corner of it. It was damp. Not soaked, just humid, like something had been lying under it for hours. There was no scent, no mildew, no rot, only warmth. I lifted it carefully. Underneath, the board was deeply imprinted. What had begun as pressure marks were now depressions, long and defined, following the curve of a fetal position. Head, shoulder, hip, heel, a trace of weight. Still shallow, but unmistakable. I set the blanket aside and walked the entire studio, checking the windows, the locks, every entry point. Nothing was forced, nothing open. There were no footprints, no dust trails, just the presence left behind. I returned to the cradle and looked closer at the linen. One corner of the thread had come loose. I held it up to the light and saw something tangled in it, something stiff. I plucked it free and laid it on the table beneath a magnifier. A hair, black, curled, not from a doll, not synthetic, human. Too short to be from a woman, too fine to be from a grown man. A child's hair. I didn't record video that day. I didn't document the mark. I wrapped the blanket in a zippered pouch and placed it in a drawer. That night, I left a single lamp on in the hallway and sat beside the stairs with my notebook open. The house remained quiet until 2:53 a.m. Then the breathing returned, softer, closer. I leaned forward and stared down the stairs. The air at the bottom shimmered slightly, like heat rising off asphalt, except there was no warmth. The temperature was falling. I could feel it in my throat. The breathing didn't rise, but a new sound did, fabric shifting, like something adjusting beneath the cover. Then, a creak, slow, just one. The cradle rocking. Once, then silence. I gripped the stair rail. Then came the sound I didn't expect, a high-pitched wail. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even fully formed, just a sound like lungs attempting their first scream and not quite knowing how. It stopped after 3 seconds. I didn't move. I waited, but there was nothing more. In the morning, I found the cradle exactly where it had been. The wedge had been ejected cleanly, resting upright against the wall as if gently placed. The linen was gone, so was the strap. The mattress board now held a visible shape, not deep enough to indicate mass, but too exact to be random. The space where the legs had been had extended, and in the center of the board, left behind in the grain, a single gray footprint. It was not dusty or dirty. It was ash-colored, short toes, flattened heel, pressed at an angle as though stepping down from inside. The direction pointed away from the cradle, toward the hallway. I crouched next to the footprint and studied the grain. The ash hadn't flaked. It had settled into the wood as if placed there with pressure and time. I touched it with the edge of a dry cloth. The texture was faintly greasy, like the residue left behind after handling burnt wood with bare skin. The size of the foot was wrong. It didn't match the proportions of a toddler or infant. The toes were close together, each nail slightly angled inward, but the heel was too narrow. It looked like something that had grown in the dark without room to stretch. I stood and looked toward the hallway. Nothing waited there. Nothing moved. But the footprint faced it. Not the walls, not the windows, the hall, the way out. I took the cradle apart that morning. I didn't break it. I unpinned the pegs, loosened the crossbars, removed the runners. The spindles came free without resistance. The mattress board I left intact. I placed each piece into a plastic-lined crate, wrapped it in linen, and carried it to the garage. The garage wasn't heated. Cement floor, unfinished beams, a flickering motion light near the ceiling that took 10 seconds to warm up. I cleared space near the far wall, away from anything valuable, and lowered the cradle pieces into the corner. I wedged the crate shut with 3 bungee straps. I laid the mattress board face down. When I shut the garage door, the motion light died behind me. Back in the studio, the air felt thinner. My ears were ringing. I hadn't noticed it until the sound was gone. The next 2 hours were still. I worked on a turn-of-the-century bookshelf, cleaned brass handles, reassembled a wall clock I'd meant to fix for weeks. I didn't hear a single creak. That night I stayed upstairs. The stairwell door stayed locked. I didn't hear breathing, no sound of rocking, no cries. I waited until after sunrise before unlocking the door. The studio was still empty, no blanket, no cradle. The air was flat and breathable. I let myself believe the worst had passed. I made coffee, took a shower. At 9:12 a.m. I walked into the living room and stopped. The cradle was there, not assembled, but placed. Each piece laid out carefully on the floor, arranged like the exploded diagram of a manual. The pegs next to the joints, the spindles in a row, the mattress board propped upright against the wall. Nothing else in the house had been touched. The front door was still locked. The stairwell was bolted. The garage remained closed. When I checked, the crate was empty. The bungees coiled and dropped beside it, unhooked. I didn't remember unlocking anything. I didn't remember hearing a sound, but the parts were there. I gathered them and carried them back to the studio. I didn't reassemble the cradle. I put each piece in a separate cabinet. The mattress board I laid under the workbench, face down again. That night, I wedged the studio door shut with a metal bar and a cabinet pressed flush against it. I unplugged every decorative lamp, turned off the hallway lights, and set up a pressure-activated alarm across the entryway to the kitchen. At 3:21 a.m., it went off. Just one chime. Enough to wake me, barely. I sat up in the dark and listened. No footsteps, no breath. But when I turned the light on, the alarm sensor had been rotated. Not smashed, not knocked. Twisted out of alignment by 15 degrees. The camera I left running had lost connection at 2:58 a.m. I didn't sleep again. In the morning, I checked the studio. The cradle was whole, fully assembled, sitting upright, back in its corner, but facing the wall now. The mattress board was in place. The runners were aligned. The pegs were clean. I walked in slowly, not making a sound. The air smelled different. Not rot, not smoke, just faintly metallic, like cold iron or the inside of an old pocket watch. I didn't touch the cradle, but the indentations on the mattress board were deeper. The weight of the form had pressed into it enough to alter the wood permanently. The head impression now dipped toward one side, as if the figure resting there had grown heavier and begun to lean. I returned upstairs and brought down a roll of painter's plastic. I sealed the cradle in a shroud, covering it entirely, and bound it tightly at the base with zip ties. Then I placed a box of books on top. That night, I stayed awake and watched the plastic from the top of the stairs. It didn't move, no breathing, no creaks. At 4:05 a.m., I nodded off. I woke 30 minutes later to silence. When I checked the studio, the plastic had been cut down one side. A single slit, clean, smooth, as if made with a razor. The cradle hadn't moved, but the blanket had returned, folded neatly inside, pressed in the center. I didn't touch it. I left the room and locked the door again. The next morning, I found a new set of marks, not on the cradle, on the floor. Just below the cradle's front runner, someone or something had pressed both palms into the dust. Tiny hands, not more than 4 inches across, fingers splayed, no thumbs. The prints faced outward, as if whoever made them had sat inside, pushed themselves up, and climbed down. I wiped the prints away with a dry cloth, not because I wanted to erase them, but because I couldn't stand the idea of them remaining there while I moved through the room. They were too small, too precise. There had been detail in the pressure, the curve of the knuckle, the slight asymmetry of the index finger. Real hands, not carved, not imagined, not metaphor. I left the blanket in the cradle and didn't cover it again. Plastic hadn't worked. Distance hadn't worked. Even disassembly hadn't slowed it. What was happening wasn't contained by barriers. It was something else, something rooted. That night, I fell asleep faster than I meant to. I hadn't planned on sleeping at all. I had turned every light on in the upstairs rooms. I had made a pot of coffee at 10 and left it to go cold. But somewhere around 2:45, I was lying on the couch with a book open on my chest, and the next thing I knew, I was underwater. Not really underwater, but it felt like it. I was awake, but not moving. My eyes were open, I think, though the room didn't look right. I saw it the way you see your own body in a dream, familiar and wrong. Everything was in place, but the dimensions were stretched. The corners pulled too far. The ceiling sagged like it was breathing in. I tried to sit up. I couldn't. Tried to blink. Couldn't feel my eyelids. My arms were lead. My chest was wrapped tight. There was pressure on the room, not just the air. The room. Then I heard it. The floorboards just beyond the hallway door, one creak, then another. Slow, deliberate, dragging steps, like bare feet sliding forward. Then the pause, breathing. Not near the cradle, not downstairs. Here, the sound was thick, close. Each breath came in two parts, wet inhale, stuttering release, like lungs that had never been full. I couldn't move. I felt something change in the air beside me. I don't know if I saw it directly or felt it, the way heat feels when someone stands too close behind you, the way you feel breath on the back of your neck when no one is there. It hovered, the breathing slowed, and then I felt something touch the blanket. Light pressure on my ribs, not a hand, not even weight, just the settling of something. It pulled slightly, not enough to reveal skin, just enough to tighten the fabric across my chest. The wet sound of inhaling returned. A sharp exhale blew softly across the side of my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. Then the pressure lifted. The presence pulled back. I heard it drag across the floor, back down the hallway, then silence. I gasped once and sat bolt upright. The lights were still on. The clock said 3:19. I had no memory of closing my eyes. I ran to the door and looked down the stairs. The studio was dark, but I knew it had been there. I waited until sunrise to go down. The cradle sat in the corner as still as ever, but the blanket had been unfolded, not entirely, just turned back at one corner, like something had gotten out. On the floor beside the cradle was a smear of moisture, not water, darker, slightly cloudy. I touched it with my knuckle. It was warm. I cleaned it with alcohol and a rag, but the scent lingered faintly, like old milk left too long in a sealed bottle. The cradle's runners had shifted. Each end had moved half an inch in opposite directions, not rocked, adjusted, recentered. I checked the mattress board. The indentations had grown again, now deeper on one side. The figure that slept there was no longer centered. It curled toward the outer edge, closer to the side rail, like it was preparing to pull upright. I didn't disassemble it. I didn't touch the blanket. I sat in the far corner of the studio and watched. At 11:30 a.m., I heard the floor creak behind me. I turned, expecting nothing, but one of the lower cabinets had come ajar. Inside was a pile of spare linens I hadn't touched in weeks. On top, a folded square of the same embroidered cloth. Stars, moons, a different pattern than the one in the cradle, but clearly cut from the same original sheet. It hadn't been there before. I picked it up slowly, still warm. I placed it inside a plastic sleeve, zipped it shut, and locked it in a case upstairs. That night, I slept in a chair with my back to the window. The lights stayed on, but at 3:06 a.m. they dimmed. The bulb didn't go out, it lowered. The glow bent toward the hallway, like something behind the door was drawing in the light. The breathing didn't return, but I heard fabric moving across the floor, then the faintest knock against the wall, 3 taps, soft, low to the ground. I didn't move. When the sun rose, I unlocked the studio. The cradle was facing the opposite wall, Its rear runner left a smooth arc in the dust from where it had turned. The blanket was perfectly flat, and just beside it, on the floor, was a tiny ash-colored footprint, half the size of the first. But this time, the toes pointed toward the cradle. I knelt slowly, following the track with my eyes. There was only the one print, small, smudged at the arch, shallow at the heel, but it sat directly beside the cradle's left runner, a few inches from the edge of the rug. No partner print, no stride, no trace of departure. I stood and walked a slow lap around the room. Nothing else had shifted. The windows were locked. The dust on the sill remained undisturbed. I double-checked the motion cam I had installed near the top corner. It had shut off at 2:58 a.m., battery fully drained. This had become routine. I looked at the cradle again. The wood looked darker than before, not from aging or dust, but saturation. It looked restored. No moisture, no fresh polish, just color, like something had returned to it. I waited until noon before acting. I stripped the mattress board, removed the runners, and disassembled the entire thing in silence. I placed the parts in a large canvas contractor's bag and tied it closed. I didn't look inside again. I loaded it into the trunk of my car and drove. I didn't choose a spot at random. About 20 miles outside town, past the quarry road, there's a dense patch of forest where old barns were left to rot. No trails, no park services, nothing but scrub brush and knotweed. I parked at the tree line, hiked 100 yards in, and left the bag under a moss-blackened beam that once supported part of a collapsed cattle shed. I said nothing, didn't mark the spot. On the drive back, I kept the windows down. The air felt cleaner somehow, thinner. My ears stopped ringing for the first time in days. I didn't dare call it relief, but my shoulders stopped tensing at every noise. When I returned, the house was still. The studio felt light, hollow in a good way. No blanket, no cradle. I vacuumed, rearranged the shelving, put a small copper oil lamp on the table beside the stairs. I went to bed before midnight. I didn't hear breathing that night, but I dreamt I was in the woods again. Only this time, the trees leaned inward, and I was standing at the edge of the collapsed barn, unable to remember why I'd come. The next morning, the blanket was back, folded perfectly, placed in the center of the studio floor, clean, pressed, no smell, and the stars stitched into it were sharper, brighter than before. I stood frozen for a long time. I walked a slow circle around it. The floor was clean. The dust I'd vacuumed had not returned. There were no footprints, no scuff marks. I didn't move it. I just left the room. By evening, the blanket was gone. In its place was the cradle, fully reassembled, facing the doorway. Every joint perfectly sealed. No glue, no sign of forced construction, and the wood was pristine. No wear, no scratches. Even the crack in the side panel was gone. It looked newly made. The blanket now rested inside, folded and tucked under a small lump at the center. A single handprint rested in the dust on the upper rail, smaller than before, paler, as if it had pressed there for balance while climbing back in. I backed out of the room and shut the door. The next 2 nights passed without sound. I didn't sleep deeply. I didn't trust the silence. On the 3rd night, the air shifted again. At 3:08 a.m., I smelled something strange. Not foul, not sharp, just old. The way an attic smells when a box of baby clothes is opened after years of disuse. Damp cotton, skin oils, dust cotton lace. I rose slowly from the couch and listened. No creak, no breath, but the scent thickened as I approached the stairs. I stepped lightly down into the studio. The light was already on. I hadn't left it that way. The cradle sat in its place, still facing the door, but the blanket had moved. It was no longer folded. It lay splayed across the mattress board, draped over something underneath. Not a full shape, no outline of a body, just a weight, a small form, a presence pressing upward, as if something had returned and buried itself there. I didn't step closer. but the scent deepened. I turned away and walked back up the stairs without looking again. The following morning, the blanket was smooth, flat, no weight beneath it, no wrinkles. But in the corner of the room, near the base of the bookcase, I saw something new. Another handprint, pressed into the drywall just above the floorboard. This one was different. It faced downward, as though something had tried to steady itself while crawling back into the cradle. I didn't clean it. I didn't touch anything that day. That evening, I heard a sound I hadn't heard before. From the garage, I opened the door cautiously. The smell met me first. That same softened cloth scent. The bag I had used to carry the cradle was sitting in the center of the floor, empty, untied. There were no footprints. But near the rear wall, a trail of tiny gray fibers led in a straight line toward the interior door. I followed them. They stopped just before the threshold, as if whatever had carried the parts back knew the limits. I shut the door again. That night, I left every window open. I didn't sleep, but at 3:03 a.m., I heard the floor creak once, then again, then nothing. In the morning, the air smelled clean. But when I entered the studio, the cradle had turned. It now faced the rear window, and the blanket was folded once more. But resting on the upper rail was a small, fresh handprint. Wet, the handprint clung to the wood in streaks, not like water, but something thicker, half absorbed, as if the fingers that left it were never dry. The shape was different from before. The palm was broader, the fingers longer, the middle two curled slightly inward. No fingerprints, no ridges, just smooth flesh, like the skin had been wrapped too tight. I didn't touch it. I placed a clean cloth over the rail and left it there. The blanket inside the cradle was smooth again, but I didn't look underneath. I didn't want to see if the shape was still there. I had begun to understand that whatever it was, it didn't need to move far to let me know it was present. I sat at the table and reopened the files from Dr. Lenko. He hadn't written since my last message, and I hadn't pushed. There wasn't anything left to ask. He had already warned me. I just hadn't listened early enough. I checked my shipment records again. The crate the cradle came in had a partial customs tag, illegible in places but bearing a registry number. It took 3 hours of backtracking through archived export logs to find the corresponding entry, Z, 1482 L, dated 9 April 1938. Origin listed as Vinnytsia, Ukraine. There was no name, but attached to the log was a scanned index card, yellowed and handwritten in ink. Kaliska Grobowa, Stan, Nienaruzuni, Uzitek Richwalny, Klopijek, Martu Urodzony, Imienia Brak. I copied it into a translator. Grave cradle. Condition undisturbed. Ritual use, boy, stillborn, no name. A grave cradle, I had suspected. But reading it, the clarity of the statement did something to my spine. I stood and crossed the room without thinking, opened the cabinet beneath the stairs where I kept old correspondence, and began flipping through anything that had come with the shipment. Folded at the back of a customs sleeve was a piece of paper I hadn't opened. It was brittle, brown around the edges, one corner torn away, but the ink held. I unfolded it slowly. It wasn't a shipping document. It was a record. There was a date, 27 February 1938, and a village name I didn't recognize. Below that, a single sentence in neat, cursive Cyrillic. I transcribed it and ran it through a translator. The soul will not carry if the cradle rocks before the seventh night. There was no signature, only a faint mark at the bottom edge, a charcoal cross. I placed the page beneath glass and turned back toward the cradle. The blanket had begun to move, not much, just a small depression forming at the center. No folds disturbed, but the cloth drew in slightly, tightening over something beneath. I held my breath. It pressed upward, a rise, then a shift. Then the blanket flattened again. I didn't move closer. I returned to the laptop and opened the camera feed. I rewound to the hour before. At 2:49 a.m., the cradle had rocked, not violently, just once, forward, then back. A slow, careful motion, no hands visible, no disturbance in the air. It had rocked on its own. Then at 3:06, the blanket lifted. A corner peeled back, just an inch or two, and something inside rose up. The footage wasn't clear, low light, faint interference, but what emerged was not a hand. It was something longer, too thin to be an arm, more like a folded leg bent inward, the knee sharp, the foot curved like a crescent. It lifted under the blanket, then slowly lowered. Then the fabric fell back into place. I paused the video and shut the screen. There was nothing left to study. I had all the confirmation I needed. That evening, I unplugged every camera. I turned off every light. I sat in the corner of the studio, wrapped in a blanket, waiting. The house grew colder. Around 3:02 a.m., the silence shifted. It wasn't a sound. It was the removal of sound. Everything stopped humming. No street noise, no radiator tick. Even the wind seemed to halt outside the window. Then I heard the creak. Once, then again. The cradle was rocking. I could hear the runners, slow arcs, wood on wood. Then it stopped, and I saw it. The blanket lifted, not fully, just enough. And something sat up inside the cradle. Not fast, not abrupt, just a steady rising, a shape, no more than 3 feet tall, bones visible through skin, shoulders hunched, neck long and tilted slightly, like the head didn't weigh enough to pull it down. The body was curled, arms tucked in tight against the chest. It didn't move like a child. It moved like memory, like the idea of motion half forgotten. I couldn't see the face. It didn't turn. It just sat there, rocking once more, forward, backward. Then still, the breath came last. One inhale, long, raspy, wet. It didn't exhale. It just held the air. Then slowly, almost gently, the figure laid itself back down. The blanket closed over it. The rocking stopped. I didn't sleep. When morning came, I found the cradle still, but something had changed. The shape beneath the blanket was larger, not by much, but the weight now reached both ends of the mattress board, and the pressure in the air had grown stronger, like it was waiting for something. The air in the hallway was still wrong, not cold, not warm, just shifted, like pressure building behind a sealed door. I moved quietly. The cradle hadn't returned to the nursery. The nursery itself was untouched, no sound, no drafts, no creaks, but the floor beside my bed had fresh marks, long, shallow scratches, spaced evenly apart, parallel, as if something had been dragged from that spot toward the door. I checked the cameras again. Nothing, only dead pixels where the hallway feed used to be. I ripped them out, every single one by one. Yanked them from the wall, broke the cords, shattered the little lenses in my palm. I didn't want to see it anymore, but I still heard it. Not that night, but the next. A slow, creaking rhythm, not from the nursery, from the attic. I stood under the hatch and stared up at the square of ceiling. My arms trembled as I reached for the pull string. I hesitated. Then I grabbed a chair, climbed up, and shoved the attic door open. It was pitch black, but the sound stopped instantly. I climbed the rest of the way. Dust and insulation shifted under my weight. I moved slowly, one hand on the wood beam, the other holding my phone with the flashlight on. The light skimmed across boxes, old picture frames, the ductwork, a broken crib, and then a shape half in shadow, a cradle. Not the one I bought. Older, warped, split at one end, like it had been stored for decades, maybe longer. But it was rocking, very slowly. I didn't breathe. I stepped forward. The blanket was different, tattered, gray, but folded the same way, drawn up over the middle. I didn't touch it. I crouched. I leaned close. The smell hit me first, wet wood, sour milk, something organic. I stared at the blanket. The cradle stopped moving, and then, very slowly, something inside exhaled. I heard it. Wet, slow breath through shallow lungs. I stood. I backed up. I slipped on the insulation and nearly fell through the opening. I didn't care. I dropped back into the hallway, slammed the attic door shut, and jammed a broomstick through the handle bracket to wedge it tight. Then I left the house. I drove. Nowhere in particular, just away. I kept the radio off. I didn't stop for food. I didn't stop for gas until the tank was nearly empty. I found a church, not a big one, just a squat white building off Route 37 with a locked side door and no posted hours. But I sat in the lot, engine running, watching the steeple silhouette rock gently in the wind. And that's when I saw it again. Not the cradle, not the house, just a shape, small, low to the ground, behind my car, crawling. I hit the gas. I didn't look in the mirror. I drove another 50 miles before finding a motel. Different state, different plates in the lot. I paid cash, asked for the top floor, no adjoining doors, no windows that faced the road. I shoved a chair under the handle, left the light on, and I waited. The room stayed quiet until just after 3 a.m. That's when the noise started. A slow dragging sound across the ceiling, something in the crawl space above, where there was no attic. Something small, moving, breathing, and then rocking. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I left the room key on the dresser and drove until my hands blistered on the wheel. By sundown, I had stopped at 3 gas stations, 2 rest stops, and a pawn shop off a state highway. I bought a sledgehammer. I turned back. I reached the house just after nightfall. The lights were still on. The attic hatch was open. The cradle was still there. So was the thing inside it. It didn't move when I climbed the ladder. It didn't flinch when I lifted the hammer. I brought it down once, twice. Wood splintered. The third hit cracked the base. The fourth caved the top rail. By the fifth, the blanket had started to lift, not from the force, from beneath. A hand, small, gray, slick, 4 fingers, no thumb, not a child's, something older, pretending to be. The arm bent the wrong way at the joint. The head lifted, but I didn't wait. I kept swinging until the cradle shattered, until the floorboards split, until the thing inside stopped moving. Then I climbed down. I didn't take anything with me. Not clothes, not photos, not my name. I left the front door open, and I walked into the woods. I found a ranger station 5 miles out, told them I was a squatter, said the house wasn't mine, said I didn't want to be found again, and now I live alone, different state, different name, no crib, no nursery, no photos, no lullabies. But some nights when I close my eyes, I hear wood creaking, not in my home, inside me, rocking,